Hi, welcome back to the Mob Mentality Show. My name is Austin Chadwick, and Chris Lucian is co-hosting with me. And today we have the topic, why, oh, why, Chris, aren't XP practices and good stuff like that taught in universities? So, yeah, on top of that and world hunger, Chris, we'd like you to solve it all
Yeah.
today in the next, 15 to 20 minutes here. So, what are your thoughts?
Right. Yeah. Well, it's funny. As I was going through my master's degree, at one point, I asked one of my professors what they thought about unit tests, and he said something to the effect of people doing unit tests don't know what they're doing, basically. So it was it wasn't a great thing to say. I was like, huh, that's an interesting perspective. So I thought about that a lot, and there's certainly like academia and proofs and computer science, right? Um, and it was kind of shocking to hear that a little bit. And so I do think that there is a um, there is a thought, maybe from that perspective, where a trial and error process or something along those lines is not like true, you know peer-reviewed academia or something along those lines. Like there's something about it that struck it as, you're not trying to think about the problem, optimize the algorithm, do whatever target that you're trying to hit with unit testing or test first. So I think there was like a little bit of thinking about it from that perspective, but I also think that uh, you know so if you're teaching for long-term maintainability versus teaching uh, for academic papers, there might be separate things.
Mhm.
And another thing comes to mind, which is this idea of reproducibility with machine learning problems. And so, um, when thinking about academic papers written about machine learning, and I've read lots and lots of them. Um, and one thing that you notice, and I think Google and others were trying to solve this with things like Docker combined with TensorFlow, is this idea that reproducing the results on an academic paper is almost impossible, right? And so it's funny because I think verifiability is really important in the academic world, but it doesn't really exist. And unit tests were kind of openly dismissed, but at least by professors that I talked to. And so I found both of those things kind of funny. With that said, I think that a lot of XP shops are not represented inside of the academic sphere or things along those lines. But what I've seen lately is more of an evolution towards those practices. But it's been, even with our local university, we talk a lot about extreme programming practices, for example, and that makes it into the curriculum um, as an employer that is near the school that takes on a lot of grads. Um, and so I think that's how it gets influenced. But I don't know. Have you seen things similar to that, or does that bring any thoughts to you?
Yeah, it reminds me of the episode with Kyle Arate where he was talking about, he did the analogy of the different runners, like the sprinter versus the mile runner versus the person who runs across country, right? And so you pick the runner that makes sense for what your goal is, right? Are you trying to run a
Right.
long time, or are you just trying to last for, you know, 5 seconds for a 40-yard dash, right? And so it almost makes me think that, like, yeah, I like how you brought that up from like a systems perspective. The environment of the university is there's no real need for long-term maintainability.
Right.
And so, yeah, of course they just pick the sprinter runner because the code only needs to last 5 seconds, right?
Right.
And so you never see what it's like to pick up code from 20 years ago and try to maintain it or try to extend it or try to fix a bug in it and all that kind of stuff. And so if that's your goal, then yeah, then there's not, I guess, suppose much of a need for it. But I think that flips it on its head if the goal is to train people to become effective in environments where the code lasts longer than a day or a month or even a
Right,
few months, right? So I guess it just comes back to what is the purpose of this university's degree or this university's class, or are they trying to train people up to write academic papers where the code doesn't need to live on? Or are they trying to train up people to write code that will be effective for 5, 10, 20 years in some company's product, right?
right.
And so, yeah, that reframing helps me think about it differently because my first gut reaction is like, shame on universities for not teaching this, golden thing. Um, but I guess it just comes down to what their goal is, right?
Right.
And I honestly can't even begin to think or speculate what any university's goal is for a degree, um,
Well, yeah, and I think, kind of to go into that topic a little bit, I think there's two mindsets really. It's either well, and it's kind of like a funnel, right, to the higher level degrees. And so I think one is, I'm looking at this student and I think that they have a future in academia, or I'm looking at this student and they want to get right into industry. And and so there's certainly every professor I've talked to, there's always been this delineation between an academic versus the industry professional.
mhm,
And I've had professors that started in industry and became academics, and I've also seen industry professionals that have started as academics and become, industry professionals for whatever reason, leaving the academic world.
mhm,
Um, and so, and often it's like, you spend a semester, maybe a couple of years, semester to to a couple of years writing a paper and then publishing that paper. And it'll, people, it'll get put into different books. You'll give talks on it, come out and it might be a huge breakthrough. And then you kind of go on to the next one. And often you're trying to seek funding and build a kind of almost like a portfolio of these papers, so that you get more and more funding as things go on, so that you can continue to do research. And so, but oftentimes the result is either thrown away or sold or something along those lines, and then you never look at it again, and maybe you start exploring something else. And that's why I think of the machine learning papers and Docker, which is really interesting because often people's research builds off of somebody else's research, and machine learning is so volatile that you don't get the same responses every time, and so you and the environments are so different all the time as well. So those Docker images are so important. Um, and so, uh, yeah, going down that industry or academic path, I think if it's an industry path, and often there are degrees, right? So like computer science is academic more so than a software engineering degree,
mhm.
which is kind of meant for going into industry. In a computer science degree, you have like a PhD program. The software engineering piece, maybe not. Um, and so, that fork, I think, has a lot to do with whether or not they focus on those sorts of things. But then, the student might only have enough time, a software engineering student might only have enough time to learn something like Angular or React and maybe some backend frameworks and like making an API by the time they're out of school. And so that long-term survivability doesn't necessarily make it into their set of go-to practices, right?
Yeah, yeah, and I think what raises the question is that for us, because we're in the industry, right?
Right,
I mean, at least right now, I know at one point you wrote, you did a master's level, right,
right,
for machine learning, and so I think at that point you were an academic, considering becoming a full-time academic, if I remember your story right.
right. Yeah,
Um,
I was targeting the PhD eventually. Yeah,
Nice, nice, yeah. And I think why us currently active in the industry, it comes up as a question of kind of like, wow, is there a gap here in the university process? Is that is the entry job pool is typically college students, right?
right,
And I don't know about you, but at least half, if not more, of people I work with that start out coming from college, including myself, came from computer science degree, which, as you said,
right,
is a more academic one. And every student I was working alongside with in the computer science degree, I could probably think of one maybe in each class that wanted to be an academic, and most of the others were like talking about what job they're going to go for next. And so I wonder if the problem is even deeper as far as uh, do students know what they're signing up for when they pick software engineering versus computer science? You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, and is this maybe a guidance counselor potential problem or lack thereof? Where for me, when I picked computer science, I was just saying, I was actually in my head, I was thinking, I want a job computer programming, and this is the one I picked to do that.
Right.
It never occurred to me that as, when I was like a sophomore, when I made the switch, I think from the time it was like philosophy or architecture or something, that there was this big difference between the two.
Right.
And I suspect most students don't even think about that there could be a difference. And I would
Right.
also suspect that many university programs, while there are delineation differences between the two, um, I'm not sure how aligned the goals are, right?
Yeah.
So, for example, if software engineering degree is targeted more for industry, how much percentage of the time is spent on making maintainable code? Maybe there's a disconnect there at a particular university. Maybe there's not. Like you
Yeah.
said, maybe they're like, oh, this one's not computer science, so we'll throw in an Angular class. And that's the key differentiator between this one and the other one. And maybe in one degree, the capstone is an academic paper, and then the other one, their capstone is make a real live website or something like that.
Right.
But the
Yeah.
idea, the things that XP really excel at for maintainability and agility and adaptability and extensibility and all these things and collaboration are just not even a factor for industry effectiveness.
Yeah. How many people are going to sign up for a software maintenance degree?
Rebrand, you got to rebrand,
Yeah,
it's got to get
exactly.
like a T-Dazzle name or something, right? You got to like spice up the
Yeah.
name.
Although
So
an extreme programming degree sounds really cool, so maybe that'll be yeah.
yeah.
But yeah, it's fun. It's just kind of weird. I don't think anywhere, unless it's consciously thought of, because a lot of people don't necessarily hire for extreme programming practices, or you don't see it on tons of job descriptions directly. Um, and and so, you see people saying, "Have you ever done iOS before? Have you ever done Angular, React, so on and so forth?"
Right.
Um, Android. And so I think the fallout is that the academic world, when they're preparing their degrees, and especially like universities that are forming a CIS degree or something, or a um, like computer information systems instead of just computer science, right? When you're creating that capstone that is a working website or a working mobile app, um, a lot of them never get the influence that extreme programming is important to the industry, and so I think that's dangerous.
Hmm.
But you don't, you know, we as a community, as an industry, are not signaling to the schools that that's what's needed, and so I think that's often the
Yeah.
reason why. You come out and you've learned Angular, and it's like, hey, I know this opinionated framework and I know how to follow the steps because that architecture. A lot of times people just want that, right? And what they don't realize is that by incentivizing that, you get a lot of code that you will pay a lot more for 5 years later, or you're rewriting it from the ground up 5 years later.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, that's a good point. And um, a few other things come to mind for me. One is I think it's also a natural reflection of XP's growth in the industry in general. Because if I were to take a guess, real XP is pretty rare in the industry.
Right,
So it's not too surprising that if there are universities trying to prepare people for the industry, that XP is rare in the university as well. So
right.
maybe it's just kind of like a natural progression, diffusion of innovation that maybe XP naturally growing in the world at large will improve this problem as well.
Well, and I'll
And
say that
yeah,
while I don't see XP specifically, like unit tests are now, I think, showing up in classes a lot more because
yeah.
um, I think unit tests are, 10 years ago were not on by default. And I
Hmm.
think unit tests are part of the project by default. Like if you
Hmm.
generate a new Angular app using the CLI, there are tests on the components. And I don't
Yeah.
think that was true back in the Angular days. Um, and so, uh, I think that, there are influences that are, traveling along the lines of the diffusion of innovation curve. And so I do think that the industry realizes that having, predictability and testability, and asserting that things are working is a good thing. And so pieces of extreme programming, I think, are making it in, I think it'll gradually continue to move in that direction.
Oh, cool. Nice. Yeah. I sure hope so as well. That'd be a nice rosy picture.
Right?
Um, and I think also part of it is I was fortunate that my university degree, even though it was computer science, did have some XP in it. So there was a little bit of unit testing, TDD. There was a little bit of refactoring to patterns. But what was interesting to me about it is I found it intellectually interesting, but it wasn't until about 6 or 7 years into industry experience and seeing how terribly stressful life is without XP that it dawned on me as like this amazing gem that like changed everything.
Hmm.
And so I think that's the difficulty too, is if in the academic environment you never feel the pain of not doing XP, you don't really appreciate it. It just seems like, oh, this is
Right.
lesson 5.1.2 out of 100 other lessons I have to study, right?
Right.
um, and so the significance feels low. So I remember you talking about it before, but if there were courses that made you feel the stress of
The
non-XP
gauntlet.
code or something. I don't know. Like maintain this ball of mud and you have
Yeah.
till tomorrow to fix the bug or something
Your
versus
degree will be revoked in 5 years if another student can't update it.
yeah. Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. So whatever pressure cooker you have, right? Where you, because I think what it was for me was being on a team where we created the ball of mud and then
Right.
being in front of stakeholders and customers as the ball of mud, just exploded and made the product awful. That I was kind of like, there has to be a better way than what we're doing.
Right.
And so,
Yeah, and
um,
sometimes that's just the benefit of experience. Like you can
yeah,
coach people, and I mean this is really hard. Like even in a mob programming, extreme programming environment, we often hire recent grads, and then there's a mentality of like the grass is greener on the other side, and they go to another company. I hear from them later, and it's like, oh my gosh, I had no idea that what we were doing was important. And so
yes,
it's like,
yes.
so there's certainly like we've seen more experienced developers in our environment
Mhm.
tell those people, have sort of a scared straight program almost, where it's just like, this is how it was when we were at this other company working 40 hours a week of overtime, and so yeah.
It's like the more seasoned people explaining to the youth, this is why we wear seatbelts. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, yeah, and they're just like, well, who cares?
Yeah.
I just wear a seatbelt because I have to.
Right.
And so,
100%. So, yeah, so it's a good discussion. Maybe end on a high note that it might be expanding out into the world of
yeah, yeah.
academia. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess one more way to end on a high note is how to increase representation. And I would like
Right.
for you to share your stories because I know you've been involved quite a bit with universities, and I think I've definitely seen the positive impact there. And I've gotten to join along with you in some ways, like mobbing with university teams on code and being able to teach them some XP stuff here and there. But I'm curious, just from a high level,
Hmm.
how have you kind of increased XP's representation in local universities? Like, what's been your moves?
Yeah. Well, so I was fortunate enough to still be in the middle of my master's degree, like practicing XP, right? So I had a lot of exposure to the professors at our local university while I was doing XP at the same time. And that was super helpful because I could have a discussion of like where and see like where it fits in academia and where it doesn't. Um, it was super awesome to find papers that were done. And when you go look at the code base that was put on GitHub from that paper, they had unit tests in it. So it was like, oh, yeah, I can reproduce some of the environment. I can see what's working, what's not working. Or like I said, for machine learning related things, the projects that had a Docker image associated with it was like so much more helpful to extend their research. So, I think there's certainly value in saying like the next person to take this on is going to have a good starting point to see all the tests passing or see a failure in a test when a library changes or something along those lines. But getting involved with the schools and becoming part of so there's like a C-STEM organization at our university, and being part of that board can find opportunities to include that in the curriculum, especially for a software engineering degree, because I think there's a lot of C-STEM organizations trying to expand those. And so they'll often have a committee comprised of industry professionals. And so joining those industry professional committees to influence the upcoming academic roadmap can really help. And so, I've gotten involved at that level to encourage the more influence from extreme programming practices.
Nice. Yeah. And I think some ways that that's kind of played out too is when there's opportunities for a company to get involved in a course, like for example,
Yeah.
they're looking for the team, like
Capstone
there's multiple
advisors. Yeah.
teams in a class, and then they want to build something for a company, that you be the company that raises your hand and gets involved. And,
Right.
that way you have an opportunity to influence the organization and those students, in that direction, so that you're improving the future lot of those coming out of universities. I think that's been quite cool to been a part of, and I'll link to a playlist of previous episodes where we even recorded episodes with some of those students and things like that. And so maybe I'll end with one final question, because I'm just kind of curious for your thoughts on it. Before I do, is there, this episode may come across as, like I said before, shaming of universities, but there are a lot of other universities who have made great strides in it and are kind of doing that 1% plus infinity improvement on this topic, and it's really cool to see that. So kudos to all y'all out there doing that. But one the other thing is, can you help me with my apathy, Chris? So, uh, um, I've had experiences kind of similar when you try XP in a company and it gets squashed,
Right.
where you get students hooked to XP in a class, but then the professors are actively squashing it by saying, uh, I don't care about those tests. I need 5 more features, and
Right.
things like that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it depends on what the incentive structure is too, right? So,
Sure. Yeah.
um, the when you're guiding students and they don't see the value in it, um, you know, often it might be so it can be anywhere from the micro level of like Detroit style versus London style testing, right? Because sometimes they might just need to be able to move faster, shorter term. That might be a Detroit style test. Or um, you might go as far as talking to that professor and be like, what is the real goal and incentive here?
Yeah.
Sometimes it might be I need to show as much progress as possible so that we can get funding for the C-STEM thing, right?
Yeah.
And so it might actually creating unit tests for the project might work against their ultimate
Yeah.
goal of getting funding for that thing.
Yeah.
Um, so it really just depends. And it might be a happy marriage of the two, just as an experiment, might be that the presumed unit tests show up as green bubbles within the app saying that you're ready to do the operation now because all of these things passed. So
Right.
make the test runner part of the application and make that a feature of the application so that you can see the test pass when running the app in runtime
Hmm.
mode. Then it becomes visible progress for that professor instead of something that's part of the code base that never gets seen by the end user. So I know that's kind of a manipulation, but the system, the system is perfectly organized to get the results that it's producing, right?
Exactly.
And so,
Yes. Yes,
yes,
exactly. Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. So you're right. Yeah. So I guess just the same moves you have to do in an organization. I guess you apply those moves if you're getting involved in university as well, right? It's
all
going to
right.
be a long-term process of coaching up, as well as coaching the students you're working with. So
It's very expensive to run a C-STEM program, and it's very expensive to host
yeah,
external activities as well for those students who want to do extracurricular things. And so
sure.
I think the
Yeah.
combination of those two things can really
Hmm.
influence what's being asked of as an end product. But
Yeah.
at the same time, you want the students to get the right preparation for
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
the world at large, and you have to find a way to bridge the gap between those two things.
Yeah. Yep, no, that's a great way to end it. And so, yeah, yeah, awesome. Well, please like and subscribe. Please share this episode with anybody you think you can contribute, can learn from, or contribute to this discussion. Any epiphanies they have, and maybe we'll bring them on the show to talk about it. So, as you can tell, we care a lot about this problem and helping others and helping raise up the next generation of effective programmers. So, and product developers. So, yeah, like and subscribe and mob on and have a good one. See you, everybody. Thanks.
Bye, everyone.